Okay. Um, Before we do anything else, so like, I mean, just thing that in for you guys, will you guys write down your ID number or your address? Yes. And then to get the payment request, which is due the 15th or something like that. Years. Did you get an email about having a meeting later this month? Yes. So, we haven't talked very much about this, partly because of the, final, and it's still not final, but the normal structure for this class is two thesis driven essays, and, there's, last fall was hard. As Joanne probably remembers, our students right now are in a weird spot because of COVID fund, because of AI, probably because of recruiting issues, and our students, same as students everywhere else, are also it was voted last term at the end of the fall term was to reduce from 2 to 1 these student essays. I talked to some of the English people, it was talking about Barbara Burch yesterday, and she strongly opposed that. We didn't have any English people in the first meeting, so I want to reopen that and relitigate the question of what we're going to do good to smooth things out. And that's what the traditional argument for the existence of this class relies a lot on the fact that we do a lot of writing here. And I personally, I find that the writing is one of the most valuable things I like at Georgetown. And so I have no idea what's going to happen at that meeting, but I'm trying to get as many voices as we can, because
It's only, it says participants one though, I think it one's not.
It's being recorded. Okay. Um, I'm gonna go into Canvas and just pull up the stuff that we're talking about.
We need to review the computer. Again.
Okay.
Yeah, make sure the phone's muted.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to make sure of that. Looks like it's not.
It's like, I didn't know Zoom had a way that it indicated if the mic was.
Unmute. Okay.
Yeah, should be good now.
Can you tell me what page?
217.
Here we go. All right. So all right, I think that's the best place to look at it. Pico della Mirandola, I'll tell you, I don't do the best job contextualizing this because my Renaissance history is not as facile as other parts. You'll do a better job. I should do a better job and go back and learn more about the sort of timeline of 16th century, 15th century Florence. That could help touch. Pico is a young, brash guy that actually gets in trouble with the church because he's trying to do too much, but he seems to be a really phenomenal polymath. And seems to be bringing together a lot of his learning in this document. This is just a very short bit of something much larger, but he's talking about a vision of mankind that is representative of what comes to dominate the Renaissance. Right? It stands in contrast to the medieval view of mankind, which I don't actually teach very much anymore. If you want to teach the medieval period, I found that I don't cover enough individual places to stop on the medieval period anymore. If you want to cover the medieval period in a way that shows the medieval worldview and the medieval sort of centrality of the church, Chrétien de Troyes, sort of personal is excellent for that. And you've got it. one real benefit of doing that is that, otherwise, you really don't have a functioning understanding of the medieval church before you get to Luther. And the Luther doesn't make sense unless you understand medieval Catholicism. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So if you wanted to do FDN as a background to Pico, it works really well, and Pico gives you a different view. So the medieval view of mankind is an extreme version of the Christian view that we're fallen, broken, and has a greater emphasis on our sinfulness and our amenability, which comes pretty clearly out of the ancient worldview and early Christianity, but which people like him in the Renaissance are really pushing back against by emphasizing our potential. This is not radical, but it is a change of emphasis from the traditional view of medieval Christianity. What he's doing here in the oration on the dignity of man is retelling the story of creation in a way that talks more about Adam's potential than about the choice of the fall. And he doesn't retell it in precisely the same way. It's not focused from Adam and Eve in the garden. It's focused, in fact, this story of God creating man reads more like ancient creation narratives, which Genesis looks a little bit like, but has the strong overlay of the focus on sin and expulsion from the garden. What Pico says in here is that when God got to man, he'd already given away all the special things, right? He'd given away strength to the lion, and swimming to the fish and stuff like that. So he's out against him when he had 11 in the bag, and very cold daily right here, is basically the self-determination that we see in mankind because of freedom. And if you've done Augustine, this is a strong contrast to Augustine's orientation towards the middle, at least in what we read. Right? That Augustine's view is the depravity of the will. This is also what Luther sees as we get to Luther after this. What Pico sees is focused not on our failures, but on our potential for success, and the success of outstanding examples, probably like himself, as models for the rest of us and the rest of us. So the best part, there's a couple of places where we talked about that. Highlighted it a lot. I put it on the screen up there. They're on page 219 and 220. So in 219, that's where I thought was very gracious. Like the man, when he's born, he's endowed by the Father with seeds of all sorts of sprouts of every type of plant. Whatever seeds he plants will grow and bear fruit. If he plants the seeds of sluggish passivity, he'll become a tree. If he plants those of sensory pleasure, he'll go into a beast. If he plants those of reason, heavenly creature will emerge. And if he plants those of intellect, he will be an angel and son of God. Those four make really good sense plot against the visual of the creation of being. He talks about this on both 219 and 220. And both times, he also pushes the envelope a little bit farther, which is probably one of the things that gets in trouble with Richard. He says, and if he is satisfied with the lot of none of these creatures, but recollects himself in the center of his own unity, he will become a spirit at one with them. And in the solitariness of the Father, he will transcend all things just as the Father himself is above all. This sounds very Platonic to me. This sounds like Plato talking about the ladder of loves and the ascent through through all of our sort of potentials into a unity at the highest place. I don't think it's particularly scriptural. I'm not comfortable saying it's definitely heretical, but it doesn't seem as orthodox as the rest of the options. He says the same thing on the next page. He says, 220, if you see a man dedicated to his belly crawling around on the ground, it's a shrub you see mounted. If you see a man enslaved to his senses, preoccupied with rich and temptation, blinded by the empty tricks of imagination, as if by the wiles of Calypso, it is a brute you see out of him. But if you see a philosopher considering everything with true reason, you should worship this man since it's the heaven and upon us. If you see a pure contemplator, forgetful of his body and lost in the depths of his mind, this man is not earthly or heavenly animal. He is a majestic of divinity, clothed in human flesh. So it can be difficult.
Getting
Right? Yeah, it's going on at the very least. Who is there who would not admire man? He goes on and wraps up at that point. I usually teach people for a day. It's a brief sort of drop in, drop out. I don't think there's much that you could or should do with it for longer than that. And I also don't belabor it very much because there's a lot of difficulty, right? It makes a lot of allusions to things that even if I put in a bunch more footnotes here, the students wouldn't even don't understand. They don't even mostly understand references to the Christian tradition anymore.
It's very good because we're having read Genesis earlier, though, comparing his vision of the creation story with what we actually text.
It threads really well if you've done Genesis and later if you've done August. Right, and it gives you a little bit of thought about each time. One thing that you could do with this is not assign them to read it at home and just ask them to come in, present the great chain of being, and then read through it together as spouse. Just using that to work on understanding sentences, and there's a lot that we gain just from having students summarize things in notes. Even just sentences.
Yeah.
Okay, you read that sentence, what's the meaning? I think that all of us probably need to be doing more of that, just to help students. Just to model the pains that students should be taking with their reading. I think it's so
There's great, I want to do stuff, but I'm going to class.
Okay.
Trying to approach it.
Okay. I'm pretty sure it's found up in the bottom of the paper. He's an ancient philosopher, but he's much more Hitachi with the medicus, but yes, it's such something that.
No, but it's good, because one of the things I try to focus on in Renaissance is why we. In the Renaissance, we see art start to, this idea of art develops as something that's like progressive, or something where the medieval, this is really speaking very generally, but art in the pre-Renaissance, followed Roman Empire, whatever, sees roughly the same. There's not this emphasis on progression, or this idea that art gets more naturalistic. This is something that comes out of the Renaissance. And it's because this idea that humans have the potential to develop their skills. And so you see artists start to look at what previous artists do and they say, oh, I can learn from that, but I can also do better, or I can develop a style that's unique to me. Versus a medieval artist who, again, broadly speaking, didn't have the same concerns as having an artistic style that was particular to themselves.
All right, yeah, and the shift from a view in which your individuality is less important to the world, to a much more individual.
Yeah.
Makes sense. I always understood medieval art in the context of sort of trying to be illustrative of the thing, and that's that, for example, many of the things about medieval art that are not lifelike, you know, are that way with the benefit of being easier to view or easier to understand. You know, when you see them either at a distance on a cathedral ceiling or if you just need things that communicate clearly to uneducated groups.
Yeah,
But again, that's much broader than your point than
no, so you're right, yeah, it's, I also, I point out like the notion of like audience when we get to the Renaissance,
Yeah.
like who's this art for that?
Oh,
And so when I'm talking about medieval art, again, it's very broadly speaking, but you know, I'll say, yeah, this obviously thinking about the audience, the faithful who are into these spaces, there's a didactic quality to this. But also I'll point out like stained glass windows from like Shar that are so high up, located in a clear story where no person is ever going to look at that. There's, you know, narrative imagery there. No one is ever, only the builders, the people that put the stained glass there, are ever going to see those narratives. So I say, who's it there for? Why is it even there? You know? And it's this idea that the artist is sort of devotional thing, even if the person doesn't exist, it's the audience isn't just man. The
Right.
audience is God. Versus the Renaissance, you see like Renaissance neoclassical churches and art, they're totally geared at like there's a notion of an audience here.
Yeah.
Art is on a human scale. The churches are on a human scale now, you know.
I really enjoyed it, some of the best really ancient mosaics without being and it's this excellent sequence of it's essentially an alcohol of the beginning of the Old Testament, this final part of the New Testament. And there's considerable detail that you can almost see from the ground. And I always struggle with that thing. It's just like, oh, my eyes are bad, but I think the point is not that my eyes bad.
I think it's an important point I try to boost, or at least a question to raise in my mind about like art making in general is this idea of the audience, and are you making art for someone else or as art for yourself, or you are making for something greater, you know? Why put in the effort to put in the details, on a church or a building that no one can appreciate, you know? Or I think I've shown them Michelangelo, some meeting sidetracks, I showed them like the Sistine Chapel, and I showed them his first part of the chapel with the ceiling, so you can Sistine Chapel ceiling. And he did the first fresco cycle, and then left for a few years and came back and did the second fresco cycle on the ceiling, and then did the Last Judgment towards the end of his life. But the first series, the figures are very small. It's like, yes, they're much smaller than the second series he came back and did a few years earlier, and I can't tell you all the top of my head which biblical scenes are from the first series, much from the second. The first series, they're small, you can't make things out. We look at the best images ever, because we can look at these things up close. From the floor, you can't make out, like the story of like the Noah and the ark. If you look at, that was from his first series. You cannot make anything out from the ground, it's so small. And he felt it was a failure, he was so disappointed when that came out. So when he came back, he made all these figures larger, he removed all the extraneous detail. It's a little more clear from the ground, it looks like that's amazing. So again, I think.
When did he have the things like the symbols all around the sides?
That was part of this, I'm pretty sure that's from like the second.
They're kind of fresh like that. Not just are they big, but are they?
They're massive. The symbols and the these but yeah, I'm just thinking about audience. These mad the way his first cycle was straight out, they're small, Michelangelo comes back. It makes things, removes extraneous detail, the figure become larger, it's a little more clear from the ground. So it's this,
Would you be willing to later in the summer, do something on Renaissance art, for the whole, cohort?
I can use some of the materials I have.
Yeah.
Afterwards.
Okay, let's talk about that later.
Yeah, I can get into this later.
Well, it's what people know about the Renaissance, so it's hard to anchor, people or anybody else, without doing a good job of the art. Yeah, help me along. Alright, so what Luther? So, I usually do Luther second, after Pico. Introducing obviously the Reformation, and, talking about, you were asking earlier about what individual things have to do with the theme, it's something that I sort of lose track of in the middle part. In the middle part, I'm usually talking about the way that we organize ourselves as humans. And the Hobbes obviously, is leaning in that direction. I think Luther is moving in the same direction as well. He's pushing back against the church and authority. And for that reason, it threads pretty well with the Hobbes as well, right? We get in Hobbes, we're dealing with English civil war, the rejection of divine right. Luther is essentially making the same maneuver on the religious front that all Cromwell's making on the political front, right? I mean, he's rejecting fault, he's rejecting authority, he's making a stand for the priesthood of the individual believer, which is something that if our students have Baptist backgrounds, if they're churchy, they're probably Baptist. Usually I get 1 or 2 Catholics in my foundation classes, and the Catholics usually know a little bit more about Catholicism than the Baptists necessarily know about Reformed Christianity. But they'll be familiar with the idea that popes are bad, and they'll certainly know from middle school or high school the idea behind the Protestant Reformation. So they'll be more familiar with the 95 Theses than they will be with concerning Christian liberty in this piece. But this piece is useful in that it is short and readable and better argumentative than the 95 Theses are. And he's arguing for a specific point that's really important to everybody's understanding of the Reformation, which is that you're saved not by works but by faith. Right, so this is why there's really important Baptists to I think all of Reformed Christianity, and to a lesser degree also to Catholicism. But it's in tension both with medieval Catholic practice and with a certain viewpoint articulated in the Book of James that what James says, and I mentioned James here because one of the favorite topics that Roger gave us many years ago that I used every year asked students to contrast their understanding of Luther with reading the Book of James, a little section early in the Book of James, where he argues that faith without works is dead. And you can give them about in the page or two of the Book of James, and they'll get plenty of understanding about it to be able to make this argument. Luther doesn't like James. Luther exiles James from his Bible. So this is an easy place to point to the tensions between the Reformed understanding of Christianity and the Catholic one as it's understood at the time. James, of course, is James the Just, is Jesus' brother. And is the leader of the Jerusalem church in early Christianity. And so he's not someone that we should dismiss lightly. Luther was an Augustinian. He's an Augustinian monk, so that fact puts him again in thread with Augustine, if you read Augustine. But Luther is driven in his animosity towards James and his understanding is driven by his readings of Paul. Whenever he says the apostle, he's talking about Paul. This is a standard sort of shorthand that our students don't pick up. But he's pointing to a lot of statements of Paul as demonstrating that the only thing that we need is faith, not any works. This is something that you can connect pretty easily with Luther's life. He's extremely pessimistic about his own worth. And this is something that we see also in Augustine, right? You see the self-loathing of sin in his early days as sort of characterizing these very holy men. That they are driven by extreme frustration and with their own inability to do better and loathing of their sins. They're driven to an extreme pessimism about mankind. And Luther's view of mankind is basically the same as Augustine's. Again, it's an Augustinian one. That we can't do anything on our own. That any salvation that we receive is not by our own merit, but by God's grace. So here's a good time for me to switch where the page is looking at and talk about the five solas. Machiavellian here. If you want to do Machiavelli, it's good. Lots of people do. I don't, so I don't talk about it in training. Here we go. Martin Luther. Here we go. Sola fide, sola gratia, and sola scriptura. There's five solas that he's famous for. These are the three that only by faith, only by grace, and only scripture as the basis for the church. Aaron will know that the Catholic Church makes a point of basing its life and worship on scripture, reason, and tradition. And the idea behind that is that reason can't be incompatible with truth, right? And that's something that most Christians will accept, regardless of how they cleave to things that, regardless of, for example, their views on the compatibility of science with the Bible. Tradition is really the sticking point because tradition means the majesty. For Catholics, tradition means the Pope is the representative of a line that goes back to Jesus himself. And his commissioning of the apostles is carried on by subsequent bishops and popes going forward, such that tradition is a reliable source of truth. And there are lots of things that in Catholic life that are based on tradition and the early history of the church that aren't in scripture. And Luther is looking at the corrupt contemporary church and rejecting the idea that the church has always held that that tradition is safeguarded by the Holy Spirit. Because it doesn't look like the Holy Spirit is safeguarding the church and whispering in the Pope's ears that you should collect money for forgiveness sins. Right? Everybody in the room will know about indulgences and the sale of indulgences. That's the story that they know about Luther and the Reformation. It's not the story that we see in this little reading, and that's actually pretty helpful because he's going more into the theology behind it. There's no argument about whether selling indulgences was wrong. Right, the Counter-Reformation on the Catholic side also made sure we stop selling indulgences. So what we're left arguing about is these three solas and the rejection of the authority of the Pope and Magisterium. Because Luther's basically setting up his own shop and hanging out a shingle as church. And he can do that because he's got support from the German prince and because he relies on scripture alone as a source of truth. The idea being that the Spirit guided the church in choosing the right scriptures to make canonical, except for James. James was a mistake. We just take it out. But that it clearly hasn't always guided corrupt humans. And so we're gonna break God's word apart from the church as the purveyor. We just discussed it. So three solas here. Salvation is only by faith. It is only by grace. And as we've just been discussing, faith should only be defined by scripture. The first two, only by faith and only by grace, are the ones that it's really only by faith that he's talking about in here. Only grace is something that if you've read Augustine, you're gonna always already know, right? Augustine's arguments about the shape of his life, about his inability to convert without God's grace operating in his life. This is all you need as background for what means only by grace, right? And he's an Augustinian monk, right? So the story of Augustine's life, just like it is now for our Pope, now is also an Augustinian priest. I think that the story of the Confessions is going to be a lot more present in popular culture for the next 20-odd years that this Pope is around. Because it is both hopeful and pessimistic, and does a good job explaining how to understand God's mercy against the context of your own failures. So let's talk about works, because works are really what the meat of this is. It is really important to help your students understand works before they start reading this. Because there is a chapter, there's a paragraph on the third page. It's on page 237. Yeah. And so it will profit nothing that the body should be adorned with sacred vestments, or dwell in holy places, or be occupied in sacred offices, or pray or fast, or do any of these things with the body. Let me switch this forward. This paragraph right here. What he's talking about here is works that you do for your faith. When our students hear works, to the degree that they understand it as meaning something like good deeds. They understand it as meaning something like go to work in soup kitchens, help homeless, things like that. When Luther is talking about works, he is talking about an understanding of penance and redemption within the church. Where you are required to do good works for the forgiveness of sins. And in particular, he's talking here also about indulgences, because the logic of indulgences is based on the logic of works. So the logic of indulgences is that you can pay money to get, starts out with your dead relatives. I think it winds up being yourself out of purgatory, right? Not out of hell, but out of purgatory.
Trying to get out of jail free card.
Correct, right? And this is what the students will understand too. But the logic about which when you put it in that term sounds abysmal, but the logic of how you get there is a sort of slippery slope, right? Because it makes a lot of sense that by doing good things, you could weigh up against the bad in your life, right? If I go out and I turn into a Mother Teresa and I help the lepers, I can build up good works in my life to help convince God that I'm not so bad. The next step in the logic is, well, what if I can't be Mother Teresa, but I can give a lot of money to the church because I've been a lawyer my whole life and I've got all this money. What if I just give a lot? Well, clearly that's a good work as well. But now you're into the exchange of money for righteousness, right? And that's where the snowball accelerates, and you might have indulgences. He never talks about indulgences here, because indulgences are kind of obviously bad. He talks about things that are much less obviously bad, and he's going for a much more radical argument, which is that none of the things that I can do have any way in my own redemption. And that paragraph that I was just talking about, he's talking about acts of devotion, especially that the medieval clergy would partake. Sacred vestments, right? That means being a priest and wearing a cassock, wearing vestments, to dwell in holy places. This is what hermits do, or be occupied in sacred offices, pray, fast, and abstain from certain meats. The office, of course, is what rules the life of all clergy throughout the history of the church. That at certain parts of the day you say certain prayers, and it's a way of castigating yourself and your natural unruliness, and making yourself more holy. Praying, fasting, abstaining from certain meats, right? Here he's talking about no fish Fridays or no meat or Lent. Something widely different, he says, will be necessary for the justification and liberty of the soul, since the things I've spoken of can be done by any impious person, and only hypocrites are produced by devotion to these things. On the other hand, it will not injure the soul, that the body should be clothed in profane raiment, should dwell in profane places, should eat and drink ordinary things, should not pray aloud, should leave undone all the things above mentioned, which may be done by the hypocrites. Right? So for students that are familiar with the book of Matthew, the emphasis on hypocrites and Pharisees in the Sermon on the Mount is something that can come to mind here, right? Jesus says, don't go pray loud in the marketplace. Go pray quietly in your house, and God will hear you. Because what we're doing when you pray loudly and publicly, or when you put on sackcloth and ashes when you fast, is you are looking for the approbation of men instead of looking to please God.
And then he even says that in Meditations.
That is the tricky thing too, right? So he goes past the things that produce hypocrites and says that even prayer will not earn you admission in heaven. And this is a standard part of Catholic penance, right? Go say 20 Hail Marys. It, again, with the idea that you can, that your devotion can demonstrate your worth. Augustine's view of our worth was that we just aren't worthy. And that's the point of saying only by grace, right? Grace is unearned forgiveness. And the emphasis really is on our inability to earn it. And this is what Luther argues throughout the whole thing, is that nothing we do can merit salvation. He doesn't use the word salvation, he uses the word justification. That is a very difficult thing for us to make before, as they're reading. So in the things that you tell them before class, if you're reading this, go through the 3 solas, tell them what works means, and make sure that they understand what justification means. Justification in Latin means being made just. And that is to say, being made just in the eyes of God. Luther uses it interchangeably with how we would say salvation. What he means by justification is going to heaven. Being able to earn going to heaven. And earn is the operative problematic word. That we can't earn it because we are not, because we're humans. And we're simply incapable of doing it. And that's built into Christianity. And that's the Christian understanding of its difference from Judaism. That Judaism is a religion of law, but that man, as humans, we are so bad we can't follow the law. And it's why Peter is such an important figure in the understanding of the early church, because Jesus says to Peter on the night before he's crucified, "Hey Peter, you're going to say you don't know me 3 times before the morning." And he does, and still becomes the leader of the church because his misdeeds are forgiven. I like the Luther a lot. I think that the argument part of the Luther reads really cleanly, even though it's fine. I've had a harder time teaching Luther the past few years, and I'm going to have to give it more space or do something about that problem this year. The middle part of the Luther is a little bit rubbish. He's got a lot in here that requires you to be pretty cognizant of scripture to follow his heart. And this is typical of late medieval argumentation, theological argumentation in particular, is that I don't know if Thomas Aquinas establishes this, or if he's just an example that we all use. You demonstrate things from scripture and from reason. And the method is part of the continuing argument that reason is never in conflict with religious truth. But he does things both ways. The other hard thing about his argument is that it's really about justification by faith alone, but he says that it's about something different. That part, reading it as an argument, again, requires a good bit of prep from you in class, and makes it harder, unfortunately, for students. Because he says, what I'm about here is proving the compatibility of these 2 apparently incompatible statements. Right? That the Christian man is both free and Lord of all, and that he is servant of all. And this is all on page 236. Right here. He says they look contradictory, but I'm going to prove to you that they're not. This is going to prove something more important about the faith He says it's gonna suit our purpose. His purpose, of course, is to defend his understanding of Christianity, which relies on, those three souls that we're talking about before. Although these statements appear contradictory, yet when they're found to be together, they will be highly serviceable to my purpose. They're both statements of Paul himself, who says, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the most valuable and easiest to approach section is the first part of the argument, which starts on page 236. Let us examine the subject in a deeper, more simple, less simple principle. So from there through page 238. Maybe the end of that second whole paragraph. Again, there's no more cruel stroke of the wrath of God. You could stop the assignment there and just have the what he's arguing about the evidence of works, the evidence. The best parts of this class are places where you can see arguments that work paragraph by paragraph, because they are the best models for good writing by our students, and they're the best material for them to understand structural reading. Right? They're looking at this argument and they're taking apart the pieces of it and trying to understand each paragraph as a premise in the argument. Not everything that we read works like that. The Hobbes works well like that. This works well like that. That one paragraph in Plato works well like that. So this is a good place for argument assignment. The argument goes basically like this: mankind is composed of two parts, body and soul. That's on the paragraph in 236. Then he says we're first going to talk about the inward man. And the section that we're talking about right now is all about the soul. Right? He goes on later to talk about the outward man, the body, starting on page 241, where he says, "Let it suffice to say this concerning the inner man and its liberty, and concerning that righteousness." I think I'm going to break up the reading this year and do it in those two parts. I might well leave out the part between them, because that's the part that I find students have more trouble latching onto. So looking at the section that we're looking at now. So first we're going to talk about the end of the thing.
So you would split, if you were doing this, you would split that first part into its like own day.
I think so. I do 15-minute days, so if you were doing 75-minute days, you might not be able to do that as easily. Yeah, I think that in a 50-minute day, you can go deep into the argumentation of something about this thing. Also, this is one of my favorite readings, and in the past, students have really responded to it. This year, they just zoned out. They tried to read it, but not okay. I gave them too much. I'm hoping that if I gave them 3 pages of Luther, and I said, "Now we're going to try this part in class," they'll find that more good. They won't necessarily succeed in understanding it, but that's because the business about works here is difficult. It's always difficult.
So you usually split it up into two if you're teaching habits.
Well, usually I spend 2 or 3 days on it, but I haven't split up the reading before.
Okay.
And I think I'll do that now, just because they have such a hard time reading carefully.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the argument here. Starting in the paragraph, "Welcome to talk of the soul, that the body should be in good condition, free and full of life." Right? He's arguing for a strict dichotomy between body and the soul. And he's basically saying, if your soul is, if your body is healthy, let's say you go to the gym all the time, that doesn't save your soul. Okay, if your body is not sick, that doesn't make you soul. Okay, all right, everybody can understand that, students follow along. Next paragraph, and so it will profit the body, profit nothing. That the body should be adorned with sacred vestments, et cetera, et cetera. This is the works, this is the Catholic works. The first one says the health of the body doesn't affect the soul, and so too works that you do with the body don't affect the soul, because there's a difference between the body and the soul. This is in fact the sort of Gnostic dualism that we see Augustine rejecting, and that in general Christianity does tend to reject. But Luther's using it because it's where it wants to. And so to catch everything aside, even speculations, meditations, etc., even prayer doesn't save the soul. What you need instead is the word of God, the gospel of Christ, who says, "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me shall not die eternally. If the Son shall make you free, you shall be free indeed. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth from out of the mouth of God." And so he says, let's hold it for certain and firmly established that the soul can do without everything except the word of God, without which all its wants are provided. None of its wants are provided. But having the word, it is rich and wants for nothing, since the word of life, etc., etc., etc. Now I'm going to leave out the no more cruel stroke of God, because that last paragraph is what makes its conclusion. So the soul needs only the word. Paragraph at the bottom of 238 asks, what is the word? And it goes on to say, well, this is the gospel. It talks about how Jesus was sent just for the ministry of the word. And on the next page, I think that previous paragraph is where he gets to faith. And this is the clearest, one of the clearest statements of his real purpose, which is that faith is not the same as works. For faith alone, 238, for faith alone and the efficacious use of the word of God brings salvation. Only faith makes you saved. And faith is not the same as works. This paragraph, has a memorable line in it. When you begin to believe, you learn at the same time that all that's in you is utterly guilty, sinful, and damnable. Sentences like that tend to be pretty divisive in classrooms. People that either started out with deeply considered Christian faiths, or people to whom Augustine's arguments make sense, people who already sort of struggle with their inability to control their passions, will read a sentence like that and find that it really resonates with them. But there are plenty of students who reject even the whole idea of external constraints on their actions and beliefs. Usually this is tied to sort of specific objections about something that they were taught was sinful that they can't accept. And usually some particular conflict with the church has caused them to reject the idea of sin, period. So I had one student that I talked to a lot 2 years ago. And we read Augustine, and she really loved reading it, but hated his point. We talked a lot. And she rejected she rejected Augustine's argument, but really what she was rejecting was the enumeration of sins that she had been taught in church. She wasn't churchy anymore. She'd grown up churchy and grown up away from the church. And people like that have baggage and also have done what they've done, thoughtfully. Right, so they have beliefs. And for her, she couldn't accept that sex was sin. And Augustine's big point is that sex is sinful. And so Augustine was a real bugbear for us. I don't find it particularly useful to talk about enumerated lists of sins in class. I find it more useful to talk about the idea that we see in Augustine also look through, that we're unable to control ourselves effectively and be as good in whatever way we define that as we wish we could. I always go back to codes, right? That I fail to control my appetites and my will when faced with sweets. And that's something that everybody usually can understand and sympathize with. I want to control my appetite, but I'm ineffective at doing it. And I find that to be a really good metaphor for the inefficaciousness of the will generally. And that gets you to the idea of sin, regardless of whether you agree with the lists of what the sins are.
And it brings it to like original sin, that notion of original sin, where you don't have to talk about all these individual acts of sin.
It's just you were told not to do it, and you did it because you were told not to do it.
Or you have the capacity to do,
Yeah. Which, my 7-year-old is the same way. I told him not to do it, that's why he did it. The sin is the rejection of constraints, which is the point. It's the point in Eden, it's the point in, Augustine sees it as the whole point in all of our lives. Certainly the point of my son. But when you believe, you learn at the same time that all that's in you is utterly guilty, sinful, and damnable. The thoughtful ones are going to arrive there somewhere in their tongues. At least in my experience in generalizing that, your teens and your early 20s are about independence and pushing back against constraints, and that loses its novelty eventually, and you bump up against the wall, and learn to be frustrated with yourself, which is the place that gets you to attempts to reform yourself. But you get there through self-loathing. At least in my experience. And both Luther and Augustine are good at articulating that in ways that I don't think most of our students can internalize today, but it makes sense to them and may stick with them in their lives.
I don't know, I'm reading it, it's like, I can imagine telling students, like, once you make it through your 20s, when you realize your ability to really fuck things up pretty bad, right? And then they're like, this makes sense to you,
Like, we haven't given you enough independence yet to let you hang yourself.
Yeah.
But real soon you'll get it.
Yeah.
And you'll hang yourself real quick.
Yeah.
So if we're looking again at the Luther, there's some stuff in the middle about the priesthood of the believer, and that's useful for his argument about the compatibility of those two contraries. But he really returns to his main argument on page 243. And again, when I say main argument, I mean the one that he's really looking at, which is faith not works, salvation by faith not works. So let it suffice to say this concerning the inner man and its liberty, concerning the righteousness of faith, et cetera, et cetera. But now let's talk about the body. And here we will be able to answer the people that say, well, if I'm saved by faith, not works, then why do I have to do works? Because could I just stop doing works? And of course he says, no, you envious, terrible troll. You cannot just stop doing works. But this is the place where he develops the argumentation about what you do. And before we talk about that, I want to talk about counter-arguments. And I want to draw your attention to the chapter in They Say I Say that's about counter-arguments. So I use about 3 or 4 chapters in They Say I Say every year. I think it's important to try and use this textbook because we made it by it. It's important to get familiar with it so that you'll know where the material is that we'll use in the future. And there are also certain things that this textbook really helps with that students have a hard time. They have a hard time with manipulating quotes. Right? And so last time we talked about the chapter 1, starting with what others are saying and how to quote and how to summarize. So I use those chapters. The other chapter that I always use is this chapter on counter-arguments. It's called Skeptics May Object, Planting a Naysayer in the Text. And the thing that characterizes Foundations 111 style of writing and that distinguishes it from what they've done in their high school years is our insistence on a counter-argument as part of developing your arguments. They're used to writing 5-paragraph essays. I think they're less used to it now than they used to be, but we'll get back to the point where they're fine, okay at writing 5-paragraph essays. But they're not going to come to college with an honesty about argumentation, because high school doesn't have room to deal with arguments and argumentation more thoroughly. All the questions that we ask them are questions that that have 2 live possible answers. Otherwise, they're worthless to us because they don't really prompt them to consider counter-arguments. But most of the things that we read that are excellent arguments, and most of the writing that we ask them to do, is develop your argument and then consider how someone would object to it reasonably and powerfully, and you try and answer that objection. And at its best, this is true finding, right? Because if you find that your counter argument that you can't answer the objection, you should change your position, and that sometimes happens. At least this teaches people that we should try to be generous with skeptics in the pursuit of truth. At the very least, we should cover our asses when we make arguments. So skeptics may object. Most of the enlightenment pieces that we read have counter-arguments built into them. And so it's important at this point to be able to talk about counter-arguments. So counter-arguments always have 2 pieces. There's always the objection and there's the rebuttal. And I tend to do those in 1 paragraph. I tend to encourage my students to do both of those in 1 paragraph, but it kind of violates the rules of paragraph if we do that. So if you're more of a fundamentalist about paragraph unity, you would encourage your students to do them in 2 paragraphs. 1 paragraph about the objection and a different paragraph about the response to the objection. So this is the counter-argument in Luther's argument. Luther's argument is that you're saved by faith, not works. The objection is Well, then why are we commanded to do works? If we're not saved by them, if they're not important in the economy of salvation. And his answer here is twofold. There are two pieces to his answer. The first one is on page 244. It's really the top. It's the second paragraph. Lastly, of this section, it's the first paragraph of 244. 243 starts. Lastly, we'll speak to those works which he performs towards his name. Oh, whoops. I get too far. I'm sorry. Let's go to 241. Is that where I have this up there? It is, but okay. So now let's turn to the other part, to the outward man. Here we should see an answer to those who, taking offense at the word of faith, say, if faith does everything and by itself suffices for justification, then why are good works commanded? Are we to take our ease and do no works, content with faith? No, you impious man, no. That would really be the case if we were already in heaven. It's basically what he's saying. But that won't happen until the last day, when the dead shall be raised. As long as we live in the flesh, we are but beginning and making advances in that which shall be completed in the future life. On this account, the apostle calls that which we have in this life the first fruits of the Spirit. So the next paragraph he says, although as I've said inwardly and according to the Spirit, the man is amply not justified by faith, having all that he requires to have, still he remains in this mortal life upon the earth, in which it is necessary that he should rule his own body and have intercourse with them, which doesn't mean sex, it means talking with people. But that sentence is the most important one. It remains that he must rule his own body. In other words, why do we do works?
So disciplining the body.
Yeah, it's a mortification of the lusts, right? Of the passions of the lusts of our body's desire. By doing works like fasting, and again, it's important to understand what he means by works. We are training our body to be subordinate to the commands of our soul. And we're recognizing that we have unruly bodies that are the sources of our lusts and our desires, and that we must try to keep these from ruling us. We must rule them instead. So the first reason why is that our bodies are always struggling with our souls, and we have to teach our bodies to get in line. That's what he said in the bottom chart. This goes on. The second reason is what we get to on page 243. So this much we say concerning works in general, and those practices as regard to his own body. It's helpful to teach students to look for the way that signposting looks like this, where he says, okay, I'm done with this section of the art. Lastly, we'll speak of those works which he performs towards his neighbor. For a man does not live for himself alone in this mortal body, in order to work on its account, but for all men on earth. Nay, he lives only for other people. So what is the second reason that we should do works?
Man, it's someone that humans live with other humans, like that. Reading this, it seems like he's saying that, like, you have to live in society.
Yeah, you have to live in society, and the good of others is a per se good.
Yes.
Right, because Christianity teaches us to love others as ourselves. So he says in 244, here is the truly Christian life. Here is faith really working by love. When a man applies himself with joy and love to the works of that freest servitude, in which he serves others voluntarily and for nothing, himself abundantly satisfied with the fullness and riches of his own faith. So, you could stop it there. If you let them read to the rest, they're gonna, like before, they're gonna find a few more paragraphs that sort of fill it out, supply scriptural backing for it. But essentially, the argument of the Luther is broken up into those two pieces, and the second part into two sub pieces. And the first part is about the idea that we are saved only by faith, not works. The second part is the counter argument about why works are necessary, even if they don't get us to heaven. When you phrase it like this, there's a lot in here that you can rephrase in ways that make morality a bit clear, right? Like, are you doing works just so that you can get into heaven? Doesn't that seem like bad motivation? Doesn't that seem like hypocrisy? It's the problem of altruism, right? If you're doing good things for other people for the credit that redounds to you for doing them, then does that mean that altruism doesn't really exist? So we have to do works, but we do them in truly selfless ways that in which we police our motives. Right, just like Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, it's all about motives, right? You've heard, don't kill. I say don't get mad, right? Because they're the same thing. Our motives and our intentions. Right? So I'll say again, I really love this reading. I'm Catholic and I really love this reading. I find it really powerful, clear. Students usually in other years than this last one, you know, half and half. This year is really hard.
I think the students, like you said, who are have a Baptist background, are familiar with this idea, kind of.
So
They have trouble seeing the text carefully because they feel like they already know this idea.
So you're bringing up a good point, which is that there's two parts of students engaging with the text. The one is sort of the discipline to read it successfully. The other one is just interest. And you can get a lot from just interest, even if they're not all that good. They are willing to do the work based on interest. And there's a couple places that interest comes from. You can supply the interest through your contextualizing work class. Or they're just people that bring their interest from something external. Baptists are drawn to Luther if they know that, because they celebrate Reformation Day, because they have a sense that Luther's important to their faith. They've got a little bit of background in their head.
Or even if they don't know Luther at all, they just read, not justified by works.
Yeah. Catholics are going to read it because they hate Luther, right? So motivated people on both sides are going to be valuable in the classroom on that day. We don't have as many religious people in our seats as we used to. So the sort of natural interest has flagged a little bit, and we got to do more to supply. Another place, that's relevant today, where natural interest takes too far, is the Rousseau. Because Rousseau is using slavery as a metaphor for monarchy. Black students really tune in. Because slavery is language that they understand and care about. Rousseau is hard reading, but you may find that students that have not been particularly engaged in the white Renaissance tune in when it's another white guy talking about kings, but he's talking about kings using a metaphor that feels really close to home. That's a useful and powerful force and tool in class. Just like any time that you get students that are really engaged for whatever reason, right? Like you use them the best that you can to generate widespread engagement. So there's any questions on the board?
I like this one too, you know, whatever being was Catholic, I like them. It's a good thing.
I mean, I wasn't raised Catholic, and so I don't have the sort of Catholic animosity for it. But I do sort of recognize in both him and Augustine this sort of arriving at your 20s in self-loathing and self-disappointment. Right, and the sort of moral frankness,
Yeah,
I think, is something that especially the men in the class already at 18 are discovering their inability to control themselves.
yeah.
The women are less familiar at 18 with their own failings. Yeah, I'll feel free.
I have something other than that was my own interest or whatever, like Luther, his early religious life was like so dominated by like scrupulosity. You know, he was like someone that was incredibly penitential,
Yeah.
was incredibly concerned for his soul, you know, like. I think he went to confession every day, did, you know, his fellow monks thought he was like way over the top of this. And you can sort of see how. You know, we should write a good line, yes.
Yeah. I agree. Talk about ops. Let's go down to ops. All right, so Hobbes is important. It is an excellent argument. It is important to the structure of the class, even more than it's important to the history of intellectual thought. We have a really clean argument assignment from Hobbes that I strongly encourage you to use. Hobbes's argument is laid out clearly in about 5 or 6 paragraphs. The students can do it if they try hard enough, but they will probably not succeed at getting it right in class. That's fine. I think I told you last time that I do all my argument assignments as group work because it gives me a way to sort of couch their likely failure in ways that don't feel so personal. It also is sort of less onerous than just giving everybody this homework assignment and I have to with this homework assignments.
So you're gonna do this in class?
What's that?
You're gonna do this in class?
So I had to do it at home and we go over it in class and I grade them based on the work in class and I had.
But if you're gonna do this group work, are you assigned to groups?
Yes, I assigned groups. You can either use, so Canvas has a good group generator. And once you generate those groups, it'll just, it's easy enough to keep those groups throughout the rest of the term. I found that logistics is easier if they're gonna work with the same groups 3 times. Because they don't have to make new friends and deal with the sort of startup costs of doing group work. They know what each one's sort of schedule constraints are. And again, group work will fail if you don't give them a lot of lead time. Because they will just say, oh, I can't do that, my schedule doesn't let me do that. But if you give them a week or more lead time, you can tell them you must do this, you must find the time to do this. So what I do is I have them, I think we read it one day and then we come back in and I have them talk about, we talk about it on the first day. And then I send them home to do the argument assignment. And then we come back and then on the second day, we go through the argument assignment together in class. And the argument assignment is essentially, what is the conclusion? What are 1 or 2 premises? Now tell me the story. So it's essentially finding the premises of the conclusion. It also asks them to evaluate it, but I don't even get to that because the structural reading work of finding the argument and talking about his thesis is an algebra. What I'll do in class is I'll break them up into their groups and I'll just, for each part of the assignment, we'll go around the room and I'll say, okay, where do you think the conclusions? What about your group? What do you think the conclusion is? What do you think the conclusion is?
Actually surprised how short this is, because I remember
Yep.
talking about it for a long time.
I know, right? So let me pull up the chain controls.
There's a lot of things to their essays on this.
Yep. I think that's partly because everything else in the middle section is so hard. I used to have more people write about Luther than I did this year, by a lot. But assignment bank, there too. Anyway, argument had Hobbes generic. Okay, so chapter 13 of Hobbes' Leviathan and concludes a succinct argument that the state of nature is always a state of war. So this paragraph right here says what the argument claims. So they need to read that and think about that as they're trying to answer it. Reread the argument skill document on Moodle and complete the following tasks. Oh, Moodle, that should say Canvas. Identify the conclusion of the argument. Hobbes gives a clear conclusion indicator, and you may simply quote the relevant sentence verbatim. Identify at least one premise of the argument. You may either quote or paraphrase it. And then give an overview of the argument in paragraph form, then reconstruct it in argument list form, which basically means find all the premise. So step 1, find the conclusion. Step 2, find a premise. Step 4, find all the premises. So close that, or just go back to the other thing. Oh, wrong one. Yep. Oh, I thought I had it in, I guess so. All right, so, quick background on Hobbes. So this is all in the context here. The relevant context of the English Civil War, right? So, Charles I gets overthrown by Oliver Cromwell, Protectorate. It's a messy mess. Hobbes is writing after the Restoration. The most important thing to say about the English Civil War, and the most helpful thing for understanding Hobbes, is that overthrowing a king entails the fundamental rejection of divine recognition, which is part and parcel with the great chain of being that we're talking about. Right? The medieval worldview is that we all have our places assigned by God in society. And that just as, you know, the three of us would probably be serfs, maybe we'd be a little bit better, maybe two of us would manage to be clergy, sorry for you. But the king is also put there by God. Like, we're put in our lowly places by God, people are put in their high places by God. And rejecting the authority of the king is rejecting God's will. There are places later, Rousseau is going to deal with sort of one objection to this, which is that powers come from God, also all bad things do too. So does that mean that you have to accept all bad things without fighting? But obviously overthrowing the king is a very big deal. And in such an ancient monarchy as Britain, it is obviously very treason, right? But it's also a rejection of the understanding that we all have places in society. If then you've dumbed down the idea of divine recognition, and you go back to having, which they did, you now have a problem with the justification of that harm. And what Hobbes is working on here is developing an argument in social science that in reason, we must all accept monarchy as better than it. And because this is a necessary conclusion, it doesn't have to be a thing that we physically assent in doing. It's that rationally we must accept that government of whatever kind, no matter how abusive it is better than the alternative of anarchy. That's why he's arguing about the natural state of mankind. And arguing that it is super duper bad to not have government. Because in the subsequent chapters, which we have on the Canvas site, and if you've never read, it repays the 20 minutes to go read them. The subsequent chapters develop the argument that therefore you should accept a king. We stopped doing those chapters 8 years ago because it was too much. And it seemed better to focus the students on a tight little argument, which is what we have today.
Does he address other forms of government?
No, because he's monarchist. And for him, the extreme case is all you need to think, right? You should accept even a time, right? The worst possible. Of course, you could accept other forms of government too. Brad's got to ask about Hobbes, because I don't know the entirety of the Hobbes. He probably does talk about the idea that monarchy is better than other forms of government. Anyway. But what we got here is just an argument about the state of mankind in the state of nature. The state of nature is a thought experiment. And I think that Hobbes is the first one to do this social contract thought experiment. Locke does it too. It's possible that Locke is, it looks like Hobbes there. So the idea here is that we imagine what mankind is like with no government. And we imagine how the consequences of that state of nature play out. And for Hobbes, the thought experiment is about demonstrating that things are so bad that you must rationally accept them. For Locke, the thought experiment works a little bit different. But so that's how we get from the sort of broader point, which is about monarchy, to this specific argument about this is what mankind is like with no government. And it sort of requires constant reframe or constant framing, doing it again and again to students to remind them that this is about monarchy. And it's good to do, and it's useful. But the work that you're doing in class here, on day one, it's setting up a general understanding of Hobbes' thought experiment. I have them read it and come in and I just talk for 50 minutes. And essentially I reframe the thought experiment in terms that are easier for them to understand. As let's name it. Lord of the Flies. Right. So it's a sort of Lord of the Flies. You're stuck on an island, evolved into a state of constant war. And I go through the individual arguments with examples, right? I'm trying to show them that we're all equal in nothing. Right? Because the first premise is equality, but not absolute equality. Right? It says on scroll to the next page. He says on page 248 that nature makes man equal in nothing. So equal in faculties of body and mind that though there may be found one man sometimes manifestly stronger in body or quicker in mind than another, yet when all is reckoned together, it's not so much that they can't kill each other, that the smartest or the strongest can't be overthrown. And so we usually have a lot of fun imagining, well, who's the strongest guy on campus? Okay, I'm gonna make him king of our lives, right? You know, going through, well, does that mean that he gets all of it? Well, no, because we could gain arguments, right? 10 of us would get the jump on him, or we could trigger. And Hobbes is really clear about this, right? The weakest has strength enough to kill the strongest either by secret machination, trickery, or by confederacy with others, in the same nature as himself. Right? He goes on in the second paragraph to talk about sort of the quality of mental resources. So those first two paragraphs are about equality, enough equality. The third paragraph. From this equality of ability arises the quality of hope and attain our ends. This is talking about competition. They will not be able to read these turgid sentences and understand them the first time. That is why I have them written one night. We talk about it one day. We go through the individual things that I want them to understand, and then I send them home. They will still struggle to understand these sentences, but hopefully they will feel in the group that they can make some progress. So the first one's about competition. And he says that so if any two men desire the same thing, they become enemies. The next one is hard because of the word dividends. And if I had my druthers, no, let me put it a different way. If we were teaching this in French or in Spanish, we wouldn't have to use the word dividends. We could translate it into something clearer. But because we're teaching it in English, and he wrote this in English, we're stuck. Diffidence here got poorly translated in our text for many years. What it means is an inability to trust on him. And so the new footnote says that. The point here, though, is that from this diffidence of one another, there's no way for any man to secure himself so reasonable as anticipation. This paragraph isn't about the lack of trust, it's about the anticipatory violence that results from the lack of trust. Right? If the three of us are on an island and I know that you two are rationally scheming against me, then it is rational for me to act first instead of waiting on my defendants. And because competition puts us in a state of war, it is necessary that each of us is scheming against the other. And so, if I kill one of you, it is not just rational, but not unjust. Partly because there's no government and nothing's unjust about government, but partly because I am the same line of self-defense applies because we're in a state of war. So that paragraph's hard because of the the next paragraph is hard because it's hard for a different reason. So it's this one. So again, men have no pleasure, but on the contrary, a great deal of grief in keeping company, where there's no power able to overawe them all. So there are words in here that students have trouble with, like overall, but you can get them over that, right? Scared straight, right? That's the idea here. The government's job is to keep us in fear of breaking the laws. The context of this paragraph, I think, is Aristotle's argument that we are naturally social animals. And the assumption that follows from that absent of government, we would naturally be organized. He says that that's not the case in the state of nature. And so he's arguing upstream. The
The reason that he says we would not naturally organize is that absent a government to keep us all scared straight, we have to spend a lot of emotional energy worrying about what people think about us. And that we have to protect our reputations much more strenuously than we do in civil society. So when I'm talking about this one, I typically use mob movies as the way to understand it, or sort of a gang mentality that if someone disrespects you publicly, you have to make an example out of it. So what he says here is, every man looks at his companion should value him the same rate he sets upon himself, right? I think I'm important, you must think that I'm important, I require that. And upon all signs of contempt or undervaluing, he naturally endeavors, as far as he dares, to extort a greater value from his contenders by damaging from others by the example. This is one sentence. There's parentheses in there, and lots of commas, but it's one sentence. Still, students have a really hard time describing it. So what does it mean to extort a higher value from his contenders by damage?
Well, damaging them. Assume.
Yes, exactly, right? Like, if you disrespect the
Yeah.
population, right, then I will hurt you and cause you to respect it. What then does it mean to extort a higher value from everybody else by the example?
They won't want to insult you because.
Correct.
they know you.
Right, so Aaron insults me, I give him a beating, you will be scared to insult in the future. Right, so it's a fun thought experiment when the students understand all the parts of it. It's just that the language is hard enough that they have trouble understanding.
Very long sentences.
They are very long sentences, and so if you're good and slow, you can work with them about how to approach long sentences. Right? Look for the main clause, read over the parentheses, come back to the subordinate clauses. It's hard, but possible. After that, we get a summation. And the summation is actually both really helpful and really confusing to students. They will many of them think that this summation is the conclusion. So that in the nature of man, because it starts with so. Yeah. In the nature of man, we find three principal causes of quarrel: competition, diffidence, glory. Which sums up the three things that we've just gone through. Very helpful. The first one makes men invade for gain. The second for safety, the third for reputation. First one use violence, etc., etc., etc. Now here's where we get the conclusion. Hereby, therefore, it is manifest clear that during the time men without a common power to keep them law and all, without a government, that they're in that condition which is called war. And a war such as such a war as is of every man against every man. In other words, life without a government is war. He goes on and describes the consequences of that in all the things that we're unable to do. And he gets to his famous line, nasty British and short, right? I think that's one page. Oh yeah, no, the next paragraph is the consequences. The life of man, solitary, or nasty British and short. But all of the other things you can go through with them of, well, what can't you do because it's war all the time? Well, you can't, you get no culture of the earth. It's a farm, right? No navigation, no use of commodities that may be imported by sea for trade. No commodious building, okay, you can't have bulldozers and cranes and things. No instruments of moving and removing things such as require much force. All these things are just things that require cooperation to do. Um, So, let me put it to you. Read, what is he doing when he says this? It may seem strange to some man that is not well aware of these things, that nature should thus disassociate and render men apt to invade and destroy one another. And he may therefore, not trusting to this inference made from the passions, desire perhaps to have the same thing confirmed by experience. What does he start?
This is all theoretical, and someone might ask for
And that person
specific evidence,
would be objecting to my argument, right?
so counter.
Bingo, right, so right here is sort of counter. The counter argument at first is, okay, this is all theoretical, you wanna see it in real life, well, you act this way. Don't you lock your doors at night? Don't you carry a pistol when you ride abroad in the country? All of these things show that you have low esteem of your fellow man. And that without police around, you think that they will harm you. Don't you lock your cabinets in your house, even against the people in your house? Oh, yeah, okay. It makes me feel bad about my opinion of mankind, but yeah. He also says, in the next paragraph, maybe someone may think that it was never like this, there was never a real time like this. And he says, well, there's the Americas, they're like this. But also think about civil wars and the enforcement of the laws, very good, the way that people act, and of course, it is the democracies. So it's quite fresh. He also says that think about the way that states and kings act towards one another. And they act in equally unconstrained ways. Down at the end, he gets to the sort of things that we lose from not having a government, like justice, property. Property is really an important one. You can't have property without a government because there's no ownership, there's just possession. That's the thing that Rousseau linked to in the next series.
The assignment doesn't get into evaluating the counter argument, but it does ask them to raise potential objections. And those are, of course, supplied by them. So when you talk about this in class, the best case is you want them to understand that last section as doing the work of counter. And by this point, they may well be writing or having written already one of their papers. So they're familiar with that. And the beauty of this class is the way that it threads together the practice of argument with the reading and analysis of arguments. And it really gives them more of a running start at an argument, I think, than it would be possible to get in a different sort of class. Like I said, this is a hard class. This is a hard reading to do. And so you should expect them to have middling achievement on this assignment.
My approach to the argument assignments is that they are developmental. That the real summative work is what you're doing in the paper. And I expect them to flail in these argument assignments. I want them to do better, but I don't really put them down hard. And I may be the wrong ones. But for me, this is the first that they're doing argument really in their lives. I want them to try hard,
we're gonna talk about it in class. Usually, oftentimes what I do is that, after we talk about it in class, I usually give a chance to revise. And submit it again, because Canvas can take these submissions, within 24 hours. I agree that I'll have 4 groups, 5 groups, so I'll have 5 things to grade instead of 20 things to grade. And that's a big help for me managing the class, because we're also working on papers at the same time, there's a lot of balls up in the air. And that's the work of streamlining this class, is trying to figure out how to reduce the balls that got, so that we be more responsible in grades. And not go wrong.
So with group assignments, and I guess because I've never used group assignments,
Yeah.
even though I think I went for this class, I knew everything you said. You have them for the argument, submit one paper, this is maybe 10 questions, and then you give everyone in that group about the same grade.
Yeah, and obviously there's problems with that, right? If you,
Yeah.
but it's the same problem that always inheres in group assignments.
Yeah.
And, if they come back and say, hey, Bobby just didn't,
Totally, yeah.
then you can put your finger on it.
Yeah.
Right, but if it's like, I'm upset because I did more of the work than the other people did. You can also just turn it back on them and say, part of the group work is for you to develop as cooperative.
Yeah, and you bring it in.
Yeah, right, so like, I'm gonna grade you based on the work that you all turned in. You need to find a way to work through this.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Any questions on numbers? Again, it does not get to, and so we should accept it.
Yeah.
And so you need to remind them of that at the end, and that lots of places to do it. He says at the end, he illustrates how bad things are, and says that the passions that incline men towards peace are fear of death, desire of things, hope by industry to attainment, and reason suggests convenient articles of peace, which is the next thing that they talk about. What are the rules that we have to lay down in order to get out of this situation? And the main one is make agreements and keep them, which gets you into Rousseau. Because Rousseau's argument about the social contract is that it all runs on agreements. So let me put this away and we'll turn to Rousseau. Foundations reader. Oh, here is the frontispiece for Leviathan for Hobbes. It's cool and it shows up in a lot of republications. What you can't see here, but you can see by zooming in, is that the monarch is made of tiny people. So it's it's an image of the Commonwealth, right? It's an illustration of Hobbes's view. Anyway, that's kind of neat.
I have a question.
Yep.
I'm really big on Northern Hobbes.
Mhm.
So in the full text where Hobbes discusses monarchy and monarchy, is he making an argument for monarchy that isn't rooted in the divine right?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's so it's an alternative to divine right kingship.
That's what I was.
Because divine right kingship no longer feels forceful.
Yeah.
Like we overthrew it, nothing pestilential happened. Now we're going back to it, because it's better, but we gotta come up with a new reason to have that, so. All right, Rousseau is French, he's Swiss from Geneva. Geneva has a sort of republic. Government, so he's an anti-monarch. And he is talking about France, which has an absolute monarch. And he is arguing against kingship, mostly by using the metaphor of slavery.
So his piece is called Owner Social Contract. Like Hobbes and Locke, he's talking about what the sort of necessary rational agreement is that we all participate in through government. Unlike Hobbes, he's not setting out to prove that as bad as government is, you must accept it. He's setting out to prove that we find ourselves enslaved and that there are better alternatives to that. He lays out what a proper social contract is. And to put last things first, he says it's that everyone, without exception, puts themselves entirely at the power of the general will. And what that boils down to is that nobody's above the law. And that means that kings aren't above the law. And so you can assume that he might accept the idea of kings as governors to some degree, but certainly not an absolute monarch, like those. I don't know how this will teach this year. I don't think our students really are very political. But if you were teaching a group of 35-year-olds this material this year, the question of whether people are above the law, whether the government is above the law, will be a really contentious issue. Yeah. Some students tend not to be very politically cognizant. Anyway, so book one. You look at chapter 1, it says, man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. Someone believes he is the master of others, does not escape in the morning, slave of the day. How did this happen? I don't know. What can render it legitimate? That I can solve. I can suggest changes to the social contract that make it less unjust. So he says, the social order is a sacred right that serves as the foundations of all others. This right, however, doesn't come from nature and is thus founded on conventions. I wish, this is written in French, I wish they used a different word when they translated it. We use this translation because it's generally good and it's mostly free to us. I really wish he had said it. I think to make this intelligible to your students, you need to help them focus on substituting the word agreement for the word convention. And they will instantly find it a lot more intelligible. In other ways, this is a really good translation, but that one choice is one I actually. He says, it's a matter of knowing what these conventions are. But before coming to that, I have to establish that I've first asserted. In other words, I'm going to first establish that the social order is rooted in convention. So the first 3 chapters on the first societies, the chapter 2, 3, and 4, all of those are about arguments that society is rooted in conventions, in agreements. And all of these are aimed at traditional arguments for and defenses of kings. But they're framed as objections to his assertion that he's under. So they're almost like counter arguments, but it's not helpful to call them that. So on the first societies. Here he's talking about families. Families are the first societies, but even families are, if not founded on agreement, they subsist on agreements. Obviously, families don't spring into being by the children's consent, but as I said, once they age out of dependency on their parents, they maintain that affiliation only through agreement.
Right, a 19-year-old that no longer requires his parents' support to live may go away and stop talking to his parents. That happens more today than it used to. If the family subsists, it does so only based on. Right, so there's the argument of that check. There's a very important counter argument here down at the bottom. And Rousseau's counter arguments get pretty hairy to follow. He uses a good bit of sarcastic tone. And they're also deep in the weeds of intellectual argument, and that's a hard thing for students. You may want to ask students to focus on the first 3 paragraphs and talk about bottom of class. I considered leaving it out, but the counter argument to this first section is where he first talks about slavery. So that's important, especially because it's going to come back to slavery soon. So again, it's framed recognizably as an objection. Grotius, Hugo Grote, Dutch jurist, argues that not all human power is established for the benefit of those who are governed. He cites slavery as an example. In other words, not every society is not necessarily obliged to take care of it. Now, when you're thinking about this as an argument about monarchy, you can see this more clearly, right? Monarchs, it is not necessary for us to understand monarchy as a situation in which monarchs have a responsibility for it. It may be that we should understand monarchy as like slavery, in which the owner does not owe things to the enslaved person. It could be like that monarchs just own their nations. That God made them monarchs and they are by rights just set over the nation for their own benefit instead of the benefit of the nation. Now he goes on. He says, this is his most characteristic style of art. Sorry, his most characteristic style of reasoning is always to establish right by fact. In other words, slavery exists, therefore it is just, and we can use it as an example for reasoning about other things. But he says one can use a more logical method, but not one more favorable to tyrants. In other words, he should not use the existence of slavery to establish slavery's justice. So far, so good. When he goes on, he's unpacking the whole analogy. He says, it's unclear from Grote whether the peoples of the world, all, how many people, like 5 billion? Whether all those people own their kings, or whether the kings, 50 of them or so, own all those people. And he's doing his best to make this sound absurd. And in his whole work, he seems to incline toward the former opinion. Also, Hobbes thinks that. In this way, the human race is divided into herds of cattle, each of which has a chief who guards it in order to devour it. Right? So again, this is hard for students to read, but it's funny and it's incisive. He's saying that monarchs are like shepherds who own their herds of cattle for the purpose of eating them. That my reason for existing as a subject of the King of England is to pay taxes for the support of the king. That my role in God's creation is as taxpayer.
I don't see a little sacrilegious here. I know he talks about like a shepherd
Oh, yeah.
Shepherds.
So it's less about attacking that notion from the New Testament and more about sort of the he's using a lot of classical examples behind this, so he's talking about the Greeks, to be honest.
Yeah, you don't think he's being a little cheeky?
He might be, but I don't see him being religious in the rest of it.
Yeah, I didn't know if he was putting a very subtle
Yeah.
critique of religion. I didn't know.
So we talked about Caligula, and Caligula was one of the worst Roman emperors. And he arrived at the same argument as Hobbes and wrote that either he as emperor is superior to his people, or what does he say?
Either kings were gods or the people.
There we go. Yeah, either kings were gods or people. Aristotle has also claimed that men were not naturally equal, but some were born for slave and others for men. So this is an important paragraph and one that's really hard to teach. Aristotle is correct, but he took the effect for the cause. All men born into slavery are born for slavery. Nothing is more certain. Slaves lose everything in their chains, even their desire to escape. They love their servitude just as Ulysses' companions loved their brutish condition. That is, when they were in, that is when they were pigs. When they were pigs. So then, if there are slaves by nature, that is because there have been slaves against nature. Force made the first slaves, their cowardice has kept it up. So let's be clear, by this point, African slavery is happening in the New World, widespread. Not all that widespread in the Old World. This paragraph is not particularly generous to individual enslaved peoples and their living. But it does very firmly object to the institution of slavery. The question is whether enslaved people are naturally inferior to their enslavers. And it's a question that's relevant to kings, right? For reasons we just discussed. He says they are inferior, but they have been made so by their enslavement. In other words, they were free people before, but their enslavement has removed their dignity. Including removing, for example, their desire to sleep. When we talk about slavery in America, we emphasize things like Frederick Douglass's autobiography and his narrative about his desire to effect slaves. And so this does not ring true to Americans. Especially after what was the Quentin Tarantino movie about it's like that article listing. About 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Anyway, we tend to lionize resistance narratives in the context of slavery.
And individual resistance.
Yeah. Yeah, and he's not doing that, right? But he's right that the institution of slavery violently dehumanizes people, violently causes them to feel inferior, and that fact creates an apparent inferiority. He says it creates actual inferiority. I think in class, I'm really careful when I talk about these things, and I'll say apparent inferiority. But he's very clear that this is the effect of slavery, not the cause. Aristotle said that this was the cause of slavery. And that's what Caligula sees as well. And that's what kings, they see that I am superior, this causes
my subjects to be inferior to me, and it justifies my exploitation. But in fact, they are inferior because I have exploited. Does that make sense? Okay, again, this is not the main argument of this paragraph, but it's really important if students are gonna answer the thesis-driven essay question about slavery. I've got an essay question I asked, which is, is Rousseau opposed to slavery per se, or is he using it as a metaphor for monarchy? The answer is really B, but students struggle with it so much that it answers on both sides, and it's a thing that several people want to answer. They want a question about Rousseau that engages the slavery thing. And if we can come up with a better one, then more power to whoever does. I have so chapter 3 is on the right of the alleged right of the strongest, as he talks about. And here he says enough in the first sentence, but again, he's not packing it the whole way. The strongest is never strong enough to be strongest forever. Right? But this is one of the old arguments for the justification of kingship, that he is king who is strongest, who establishes his strength by conquest. And by establishing his strength, we all have a duty to obey him. The point that he's making here is that the duty is manufactured. And that without manufacturing this idea of duty to obey, you wouldn't be able to stay strongest. Just that's how humans work. He's never strong enough to be master all the time, unless he transforms his power into right and obedience into duty. From this comes the right of the strongest, a right which, although apparently intended ironically, is truly established in principle. But are we never to receive an explanation of this phrase? Force is physical power. I do not see what morality can result from its effects. To yield to force is an act of necessity, not of will. At most, an act of prudence. In what sense can that be called a duty? And he goes into the details of unpacking this. Starting with the idea that somebody else is going to come along and be stronger someday. What happens to the duty that I had to obey the strongest guy on the island? If now somebody else is stronger than you, what kind of right transfers when the circumstances change? The other thing that he has to say in the second last paragraph, obey those in power. If that means yield to force, it is a good precept, but superfluous. Nobody needs to be told to do that. I reply that it will never be violated. All power comes from God. That I can see. But all sickness comes from him as well. Does that mean that we are forbidden to summon the doctor? And this is a good, incisive objection, right? Kings are kings by will of God. All power comes from God. So you may not object to it without violating God's will. Well, also, I stubbed my toe because of God's will. Does that mean I can't put a Band-Aid on it? Does God want my toe to turn gangrenous? And I'm forbidden from working against the things that I can work against. And that's obviously extensible as far as rebellion in the case of kings. If a brigand surprises me in part of the forest, am I not merely compelled by force to surrender my purse, but also in conscience obliged to give it to him? Because God gave him that pistol. Right? And the mugger, is it wrong to pepper spray the mugger? Because God put him there. So the last one's on slavery. The last one is fine. The second one is the one on the right of the strongest is is fun and easy-ish. So I'm gonna stand up here for this one so I can scroll through it. So since no man has a natural authority over his fellow man, and since force creates no right, therefore conventions, remember, agreements, remain as the basis of all legitimate authority among human beings. Okay, so we're recapping his general argument. But we're going to deal in more detail with slavery. If a particular individual can alienate his liberty, Grote says, and make himself the slave of a master, why could not an entire people alienate its liberty and make itself subject to a king? In this question, there are a number of ambiguous words that require an explanation, but let's restrict ourselves to the word alienate. It means to give or sell. Now, a man who makes himself the slave of someone else is not giving but selling himself, at least for his subsistence. If we acknowledge that everything's based on conventions, agreements, that even slavery is based on agreements, that it is a contract, that at least the enslaved person receives subsistence, receives food. But what does a people sell itself for? A king, far from providing his subjects their subsistence, derives his own only from them. So, do subjects surrender their persons on the condition that their goods will also be taken away? I do not see what they have left to preserve. He goes on to say that contracts without an agreed exchange are null and void. Not least because whoever entered into them must not be in their right mind. Here's the Cyclops example. Some will say that what the king provides is peace. Okay, but peace is not always desirable. That may be so, but what do they gain from that if the wars that his ambition draws them into, if his insatiable greed and the humiliating demands of his ministers bring them more desolation than their own quarrels would have done? In other words, the king doesn't guarantee international peace, he guarantees domestic tranquility, right? But what if there are wars and taxation and all of these things that are worse than domestic strife? People who live in dungeons also live peacefully. Does that make them a good place to live? The Greeks in the cave of the Cyclops lived there peacefully while awaiting their turn to be devoured. It's excellent. It's fantastic writing. Gets harder from here. So if you say that a man gives himself gratuitously for nothing, it's to make an absurd and inconceivable claim. Such an act is illegitimate and void for the sole reason that the man who does it is not in his right mind. To say the same thing about an entire people is to assume a population of madmen. Madness creates no rights. In other words, if we are imagining a contract of slavery between the king and the people, we have excluded any conceivable good that the people receive from an absolute monarch. And contracts with no exchange are void because no one would enter into them. This part is clear and moving. Imagine that each man were able to sell himself. He cannot alienate his children. They are born humans and human beings and free. Their liberty belongs to them. They alone have the right to dispose of it. No one else has that right. Before they each reach the age of reason, their father can stipulate in their name the conditions for their preservation, for their well-being, but he cannot give them away irrevocably and unconditionally. Conditionally. For such a gift is contrary to the ends of nature and goes beyond the rights of eternity. Thus, for an arbitrary government to be legitimate, in every generation, the people would have to have the power to accept or reject it. The contract, even if we're taking a slave contract as the model, the contract is only something that you and I can enter into for ourselves. And our children must have their choice about whether they enter into the contract or not, which means that we are no longer dealing with an absolute monarch. We are dealing with a periodically renewed governmental contract. We've introduced elections, essentially. This last paragraph is really hard. To renounce one's liberty is to renounce one's quality as a man, the rights of humanity, even its duties. There is no possible compensation for one who surrenders everything. Such a renunciation is incompatible with the nature of man. To remove all liberty from someone's will is to remove all morality from his actions. Finally, it's empty and contradictory convention to stipulate on the one hand absolute authority and on the other one unlimited obedience. Is it not clear that we have no obligations towards someone from whom we have not the right to demand, from whom we have the right to demand everything? So if an enslaved person, if an enslaver has total control over an enslaved person, he has no obligations towards that person. And so any idea of agreement is void. Does not this condition alone, where there is no equivalence or exchange, not involve nullifying the act? For what right would my slave have against me, since all he possesses belongs to me? Now that his right is mine, this right that I have against myself is meaningless. I don't pretend to be able to unpack this paragraph very effectively. When I talk about it in class, we usually don't get to this paragraph. I think that the most important part of it is this part, remove all morality from his actions, because we're talking about duties. It was clear when we were talking in the right of the strongest that Rousseau questioned the duty to obey. There he questioned the duty to obey somebody because they were stronger. Here he questions the duty to obey someone because they are your slave. When you remove everything, every decision from an individual who's enslaved, you remove their capacity for moral decision making. And the idea of a duty becomes contradictory. Because his duty is owned by the enslaver. And that's the best I can do today on this. It's try to stay out of the weeds right here. The students won't want to go there. It's important, but it's very, very hard.
You thought something nice and clear paragraph right after that to finish it off. And making
Oh, yeah.
it with you, which is entirely at your expense and entirely to my advantage.
Oh, yeah.
As long as it pleases me, if you will deserve it, as long as it pleases me.
Right. Be careful though, because they don't do well with sarcasm, right? So they'll see that and want to quote it, but then think that it's saying the opposite of what it's saying. So freshmen are really bad with sarcasm in writing. They're good with it in speech, right? But they have trouble recognizing that something written goes against the general tone and purpose of the larger piece. Let's go down here to the social contract. And we're going to wrap it up because we're running out of time. The chapter 5 talks about the general will thing. Chapter 6 talks about the general will. It's chapter 6. It starts by saying
let's agree that it's necessary, people have agreed it's necessary to follow stage. What will the terms of the agreement that they may be? And the terms are laid out on page 269. Says these clauses properly understood all come down to one, that is the total alienation of each member of the association, along with his rights. The entire community. In other words, give up everything.
And importantly, everyone gives up everything. So, it's right here. First of all, since each person gives himself entirely, the condition is equal for all. And since the condition is the same for everyone, no one has an interest in making it burdensome for others. All of this excludes the possibility of harm, or at least an absolute. Page 270, in the italics, summarizes it like this. He says, each one of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will. As a body, we receive each member as an indivisible part. It's not exactly clear what general will means. It doesn't mean democracy exactly, but it refers to some sort of corporate scheme. And the idea is that the important part is that everyone alienates themselves in time. But no one reserves immunity from the decisions of everyone. And that we move towards something like a public. Chapter 8 is nice. I don't get to it a lot of times, but it talks about the benefits of the civil state, and essentially it shows that without it, you don't have property. You don't have property or anything more than going on. And that's in line with what Hobbes says. But we're grown ups and we're tired of it when we get to that part. Students are getting tired. But Rousseau is difficult because on one hand, it's really difficult for students to do it well. On the other hand, students that haven't been engaged to the rest of the Renaissance environment come alive here, and I really need that as well. So I always read the Rousseau, even though I don't know that I should. It is engaging more than it is necessarily skill building. Like I said, that for me, the chemistry in the class, especially in the middle section, is one of the most important things. And by now, you may well be losing control of the class if you're not managing it carefully. Even if you are managing it carefully, right? Like this is the long march in the semester, and it's hard to manage all the timing right, and keep the chemistry right to keep everybody engaged. This is a gen ed class. There's an existing sort of resistance to it because it's a gen ed class. It's doing good and important things, but this moment of the class, late in the year 2, is the high rock. That's where you have to work the hardest to keep everybody engaged and coming, frankly. I mean, like, this is where people will stop coming. The class is set up by agreement so that we don't fail people, but that also means it doesn't kind of have the normal teeth that normal classes do. But failing people doesn't keep them from going away either. So we have these problems with all our classes, especially today. But that's what we got. I think we're doing the best we
I
can.
didn't do this one last time, but because I thought the Tom's was kind of similar to the kind of something with these. But it's also, I feel like maybe kind of nice to have a more positive response after Voss.
It's also-
Another
Yeah.
idea about organizing.
It's also nice to read things in pairs because you do the context for the first one and page level.
Right, and then he mentioned songs.
Yeah, it's like the mentions and should stuff, right? Those two pair so well together because, it's like building a living unit. So,
So I might do this.
yeah, good. We had to, let's turn this off and then we've got to find a bit of time to meet for our last one.